I opened the garage door and froze. My son's voice cut through the dark air. Why is she even still alive? His words weren't for me, but they shattered everything I thought I knew about him. I stepped inside, and what followed would erase him forever. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The day began like any other, quiet, familiar, laced with the kind of stillness that had become both a comfort and a torment since Gerald's death. I, Margaret Carter, 63 years old, rose early as I always did. My bones ached in the predictable places, knees stiff, back sore from the restless sleep that grief often delivered, but the morning sun drew me toward the garden, the one space in this house that still felt alive. The soil, cool and damp beneath my gloves, carried his memory. Gerald had planted those roses decades ago, tending them with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Even after long days at the factory, he would kneel in the dirt, coaxing the buds to life with a patience I could never match. When he died, I swore I'd keep them blooming. It was the least I could do, a daily ritual that tethered me to him. By mid-afternoon, I had clipped the withered stems and set the house in order, folding linens with the precision of someone who clings to routine as if it were armor. The silence was heavy, but I had grown used to its weight. My son Daniel lived nearby, and though he visited, the warmth that once defined his presence had dimmed in recent years. Still, I told myself I was fortunate. Many widows lived entirely alone. At least I had him. At least I had family. It was early evening when I gathered a stack of fresh linens and decided to place them in the storage trunk kept in the garage. A trivial task, ordinary, without consequence, or so I thought. I remember the way the hallway light flickered as I passed, the faint smell of detergent clinging to the folded cloth in my arms. My mind was far from anything dark. I was thinking of dinner, whether I had enough potatoes left for a stew. But as my hand reached for the cold metal handle of the garage door, voices drifted through the thin wooden frame. At first it startled me. Daniel and Melissa shouldn't have been there at that hour. I froze, uncertain whether to push the door open or retreat. Then Daniel's voice rose, low yet sharp, slicing through the quiet. Why is she still alive? She should have been gone months ago. Once she's out of the picture, everything will finally be mine. The words didn't register at first. My mind rejected them as if they belonged to a stranger. Surely I had misheard. My Daniel, my only child, couldn't possibly speak about me that way. He had been the boy who cried into my shoulder when Gerald disciplined him too harshly, the teenager I sat up waiting for during long high school nights, the man whose hand I held at his wedding when nerves threatened to consume him. That son, my son, could not have spoken those words. And yet silence followed, broken only by the faint creak of shifting weight on the concrete floor. Then another voice, softer but no less damning. Melissa's. Patience, Daniel. She's fragile. It won't take much longer. The linens slipped in my arms, nearly tumbling to the floor. I felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing the air from my lungs. The garage door vibrated beneath my trembling hand, and I pulled it back instinctively, afraid to make a sound, terrified that they might know I was there. The conversation ended there. At least that was all I allowed myself to hear. My pulse thundered in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to flee. I stumbled back into the hallway, clutching the folded fabric to my chest like a shield. Each step felt heavy, unnatural, as though my body no longer belonged to me. By the time I reached my room, I was shaking so violently that I had to set the linens down before they fell. I sank into the armchair near the window, staring at the fading light outside. The roses swayed gently in the evening breeze, oblivious to the storm unraveling inside me. Shock burned into disbelief, disbelief into a raw ache that spread through my chest. My son, the boy I had carried in my womb, the child I had raised with every ounce of strength and tenderness, was plotting my end. Not in metaphor, not in frustration, but with cold intent. I tried to rationalize it, to twist the words into something else. Perhaps he had been speaking about someone else? A colleague? A neighbor? But Melissa's reply had shattered that fragile hope. She's fragile. It won't take much longer. Who else could they have meant? My hands trembled uncontrollably as I pressed them to my face. The scent of detergent lingered faintly, absurdly, grounding me in the mundanity of a world that had just collapsed. I wanted to scream, to march into that garage and demand answers. But terror sealed my lips. For the first time in my life, I feared my own child. As the sky darkened and shadows lengthened across the floorboards, I sat unmoving, my mind replaying the words again and again, each repetition striking deeper, like a blade twisted into flesh. The son I had sacrificed for, the son I had trusted with my most vulnerable years, wanted me gone, wanted me erased, wanted me dead. The air in the house no longer felt like my own. The walls that had sheltered me for decades pressed in with suffocating silence. Somewhere beyond those walls, Daniel and Melissa were likely laughing, perhaps planning, perhaps sipping wine without a flicker of guilt. And here I sat, hollowed out, staring into a future I could no longer comprehend. That night, long before the clock struck midnight, one truth had already crystallized in my mind. The life I thought I had, the son I thought I knew, no longer existed. All that remained was the echo of his words, words that would haunt me forever. I didn't confront him then. I couldn't. My body had frozen into something brittle, fragile, as though even the act of speaking would cause me to shatter. Instead, I carried those words back to my room like a thief caught with stolen poison, clutching them close and fearing they would seep into the air if I dared to share them with anyone. That night I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, unable to close them without seeing Daniel's face as a boy, mud on his knees, hair sticking up after long days at the park, laughter spilling from him as if joy had been his birthright. And then, layered over that, the voice I had heard in the garage, low, venomous, ripping with entitlement. The two versions collided in my mind, tearing at me. Which was the real Daniel? Had the boy I loved ever truly existed, or had he been only a mask that slipped as soon as he saw fortune in his reach? I began replaying every memory I could dredge up from the last few years, examining each like shards of glass, sharp and dangerous. His tone when he spoke to me had shifted so gradually I had mistaken it for normal aging impatience. The way Mom used to come laced with warmth, but now landed like a blunt stone, short, clipped, as though he spat the word only because etiquette required it. And then those documents. I remembered them vividly. The days following Gerald's funeral, when I was still wrapped in black grief. My world was numb, and yet Daniel had arrived, his voice calm, his hand resting on my shoulder as he guided me to the kitchen table. Just sign these, Mom. It's paperwork, things Dad left undone. I'll handle the rest. Something in me had resisted then, though I couldn't have explained why. My husband had trusted me with everything. It felt wrong to surrender even a single page to someone else. I had pushed the pen away, muttering something about reading them later. Daniel's eyes had flashed with irritation, though his mouth curved in a forced smile. At the time, I thought it was grief making him impatient. Now I knew better. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself in the quiet of my mind, and with each click, my chest grew heavier. His sudden insistence on paying the bills to help me out. The way he pressed to be added as a joint account holder, claiming it would make things simpler if something happened to me. The bitter jokes he made at dinner, laughing too loudly when he said things like, "Old people just drag life out. They don't know when to quit." At the table, I had managed a stiff smile, trying to convince myself he was teasing. But in the darkness of my bedroom, the laughter curdled into cruelty. And Melissa, how could I not see it before? That calculating gleam in her eyes, masked beneath the sheen of polite small talk. I recalled the afternoon she asked, almost casually, "Margaret, have you ever thought of moving into one of those nice retirement facilities? You'd meet people, make friends, and Daniel wouldn't have to worry so much." Her tone had been syrupy sweet, but her gaze had lingered on the mantel where Gerald's photographs stood, and on the framed deed to the house hanging proudly by the doorway. I had brushed it off, convinced it was simply awkward concern. Now I knew better. Every word had been bait, testing whether I would yield my place, surrender my life into their hands. The deeper I sank into memory, the more I realized how carefully they had both prepared the stage. What I had mistaken for love, for family duty, had been calculation. My husband had left behind more than photographs and roses. He had left property, a thriving business, and investments he and I had built brick by brick through decades of sacrifice. It wasn't just sentiment I guarded, it was a fortune. And I, Margaret Carter, stood as the last obstacle between Daniel and the empire he lusted after. The thought churned inside me, black and acrid. My mind raced with images of Gerald working long hours, his hands blistered and raw from building what would one day ensure his family's security. I thought of my own sacrifices, sewing clothes late into the night, skipping meals so Daniel could eat, pouring every drop of my energy into ensuring his life would be easier than mine. And this was the fruit of those sacrifices. A son who waited like a vulture for my death, his wife whispering encouragements in the shadows. Hatred swelled in me, thick and bitter, not only toward Daniel and Melissa, but toward myself. How had I been so blind? How had I nurtured a serpent in my own home, mistaking his coiled body for the warmth of a child? Every red flag, every offhand comment, every moment of coldness I had brushed aside in the name of love returned to me like accusations. The night dragged on without sleep. I sat at the window, watching the stars blur through tears I refused to wipe away. The air was sharp, the kind that bit through the skin, but I welcomed the pain. It was honest, unlike the false comfort of Daniel's dutiful visits. By dawn, my world had shifted. I was no longer the naive mother who believed family blood guaranteed loyalty. I saw my son for what he was, a man hollowed out by greed, ready to carve up his own bloodline for wealth. And still, beneath the boiling hatred, another truth festered, a shame that gnawed at me. For years, I had defended him against whispers, excused his selfishness, justified his distance. Now I was left to ask the question no mother wants to face. Had I created this monster by loving him too blindly, by shielding him too fiercely from the world's consequences? As the sun rose, flooding the room with pale gold light, I felt none of its warmth, only the cold certainty that my life, my home, and my very existence were no longer safe. The days that followed were no longer days of routine. They were theater. Every movement, every glance, every word that passed between us was coated in a false sweetness so thick it nearly suffocated me. If I had not overheard them in the garage, perhaps I would have still been fooled, lulled into believing their smiles carried genuine affection. But now, with my ears open to the truth, I could hear the jagged edges beneath the honey. At breakfast, Daniel pulled out a chair for me, the perfect picture of a dutiful son. His voice was casual, steady, as he poured tea into my cup. "Here you go, Mom, just the way you like it. 2 sugars, no cream." Once, those words would have warmed me, but now I caught the stiffness in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered away too quickly, as if he couldn't quite look me in the eye without betraying himself. Melissa chimed in with compliments, too many, too forced. "That blouse looks lovely on you, Margaret," she said one morning, her smile stretched too wide, her gaze darting not to the fabric, but to my face, searching, calculating. She added, almost absently, "You've always had such good taste. Gerald must have adored that about you." I felt the sting in those words. She invoked my husband's name not out of respect, but to test me, to watch how I reacted, as though measuring the fragility of my emotions. The blouse, I realized, was not what she saw. What she saw was the body beneath it, aging, thinning, vulnerable. I began to test them in return. My words became weapons, sharpened through casual conversation. One evening, as we sat at the dining table, I set down my fork deliberately and said, "I've been thinking. Perhaps it's time I update my will." The silence that followed was brief but heavy, a beat too long before either spoke. Melissa's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down, her smile faltering before she smoothed it over. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes sparking with a hunger he could not hide quickly enough. "You know, Mom," he said, his tone unnaturally light, "that's actually very wise. It's always smart to put things in order early. Just in case." In case. 2 words, innocent enough on the surface, but to me they landed like a countdown. His lips curved into what might have passed as concern to an outsider, but I caught the glint in his eye. There was no fear of losing me there, no desire to protect, only anticipation. I stirred my soup, letting the silence stretch. Inside, my anger brewed like a storm gathering across the horizon. I could feel it tightening my chest, coiling in my veins. They thought they were clever, hiding behind masks of civility, but their greed had already carved fissures into their performance. Melissa spoke next, her voice lilting with practiced innocence. "Margaret, it's true. It would give you peace of mind. You'd know everything is handled exactly how you want it. And of course, Daniel will always make sure your wishes are respected." I forced a thin smile. "Yes," I said softly. "I'm sure he would." They exchanged a quick glance, so subtle I might have missed it before. Now it was a flare in the darkness, silent communication, 2 predators circling the same prey. The mask slipped further with each passing day. I began to notice things I had overlooked for years. Daniel's restlessness when I spoke about my garden, Melissa's impatience when I shared stories of Gerald. They humored me, yes, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They weren't listening. They were waiting. One afternoon, I caught Melissa in the study, running her fingers lightly along the spines of Gerald's old ledgers. She jumped when she saw me in the doorway, her smile plastered on in an instant. "Oh, I was just admiring Gerald's handwriting," she said, her voice airy. But I had seen it, the way her eyes scanned numbers, not words, her lips moving as though calculating. Even Daniel's humor, once clumsy but harmless, now cut like blades. At dinner, he laughed after spilling a drop of wine on the tablecloth. "Guess I take after Dad, clumsy till the end. Maybe I'll inherit that along with everything else." He grinned, expecting laughter. I forced mine, hollow and brittle, while inside me the storm raged louder. At night, I replayed each moment, each slip of the mask. I was no longer blind, no longer knave. I saw my son and his wife for what they truly were, not family, not caretakers, but opportunists circling a dying fire, waiting for the embers to burn out so they could claim the ashes. They thought I was fragile. They thought I would crumble under the weight of grief, age, and loneliness. They mistook my silence for weakness, my patience for surrender. But they were wrong. I had not survived Gerald's death, the weight of widowhood, and the emptiness of a hollowed home only to be erased by my own blood. They saw prey. What they failed to see was the lioness stirring beneath the frail exterior. And with every false smile, every forced kindness, every slip of the mask, my resolve hardened. The night came when silence became unbearable. For days I had carried their words like shards lodged beneath my skin, cutting deeper with every breath. Each false smile, each calculated gesture, had been gasoline poured onto the smoldering fire within me. And when I heard their voices drifting once again from the garage, low, conspiratorial, soaked in greed, I knew I could no longer hide in shadows. I would meet them in the very place where their whispers thrived. My footsteps were steady as I approached the door, though inside my blood roared like a storm-tossed sea. The air near the garage felt colder, sharper, as if even the house understood that a threshold was about to be crossed. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, trembling not with fear, but with the electric charge of fury long suppressed. Then I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, splitting their secretive murmurs into silence. Daniel spun around, his body rigid, his face draining of color. His mouth opened, but no words came, just the hollow gape of a man caught in the act. Melissa stood beside him, her knuckles whitening as her hands clutched the folds of her dress. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, a flicker of calculation racing across her features like a snake retreating to strike another day. I stepped forward, my frame small but unyielding, the dim bulb above casting long shadows that seemed to stretch my anger across the room. My chest trembled, my knees weakened, but I held my ground. The trembling was not weakness. It was rage finding its voice. You want to know why I'm still alive? My voice cut through the air, sharp, cold, deliberate. Because I'm stronger than either of you ever imagined. Daniel's lips worked around words, fumbling for control. Mom, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. I snapped, my tone laced with a fury I had never allowed myself to feel toward him before. I heard every word, every vile syllable. You've been waiting for me to die, circling like vultures. But I won't give you the satisfaction. The mask, his careful mask of dutiful son, patient caregiver, smiling face, shattered in an instant. Daniel's eyes darkened, hard and unrepentant, the boy I raised gone, replaced by a man I barely recognized. You're standing in the way of everything that's mine, he hissed. The venom in that one word, mine, burned hotter than fire. For years, I had given him everything I could. Time, love, comfort, shelter. Yet none of it had been enough. His hunger was not for family, not for love, but for ownership, for possession, for power. Melissa's voice broke through, brittle but steady. Margaret, please, don't misunderstand. Daniel only meant. Silence. The word exploded from me with more force than I knew I carried. She flinched, her lips snapping shut, though her eyes blazed with quiet defiance. I turned back to my son, every memory of his childhood flashing before me in jagged fragments, his first steps, his laughter echoing across the yard, the nights I stayed awake nursing him through fevers. All of it felt poisoned now, tainted by the man before me. You dare to speak of mine? My voice shook, but I pressed on, my anger sharpening with each word. Everything in this house, every brick, every dollar, was built by your father and me. With sweat, with sacrifice, with love. Nothing here was given to you. Nothing belongs to you. Daniel's expression twisted, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching at his sides. You're old, Mom. Tired. You don't need all of this. You're wasting it, rotting away while I could be using it. Dad would have wanted me to take it. Don't you dare invoke your father's name, I spat, cutting him off. Gerald would weep to see the greed that's hollowed you out. He worked himself into an early grave to give you a future, and you've twisted it into a curse. For a moment, the garage was silent, but for the hum of the single dangling bulb overhead. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, suspended as though even time itself paused to witness the fracture between mother and son. Melissa shifted, her composure cracking. Margaret, you're being dramatic. Of course Daniel loves you. He's just frustrated. You know how hard it's been. Frustrated. I turned to her, my eyes narrowing. Is that what you call conspiring for my death? Whispering about how fragile I am, how much longer I'll last. You think I didn't hear you? Her mouth closed with a snap, her face paling as Daniel shot her a warning glance. But I saw it, the admission buried in her silence. I stepped closer to my son, closing the distance until I could see the rapid pulse beating in his neck. My voice dropped low, heavy with conviction. I am not fragile. I am not a burden, and I am not leaving this world on your terms. He stared back at me, his face rigid, his breathing shallow. For the first time, I saw him without the disguise of sonship, without the facade of family. I saw him for what he truly was, an enemy that had grown in my own home, nurtured by my blind devotion. Inside me, something shifted. Fear, grief, confusion, all of it burned away, leaving behind only fire. The woman they thought was frail had vanished. In her place stood a mother who would not be erased. The confrontation had begun. That night in the garage marked a line I could never uncross. I saw my son's true face, hard, hungry, hollowed out by greed, and I understood there was no saving him. But I also knew this. I would not meet his treachery with violence. Not fists, not poison, not a reckless act that would soil my hands with the same darkness that consumed him. No, my revenge would be clean, sharp, and legal. I would erase him from everything that mattered, not his existence, but the life he had so arrogantly assumed would be his. The decision, once made, settled in me like steel. My anger no longer burned hot and wild. It cooled into something sharper, calmer, more dangerous. A storm distilled into ice. I spent the following days moving with quiet precision, wearing my mask as carefully as they wore theirs. I let Daniel pour my tea, let Melissa comment on my blouses. I smiled when required, nodded when spoken to, all the while concealing the plans blooming inside me. They thought I remained fragile prey, unaware of their whispered schemes. In truth, every passing hour brought me closer to their undoing. The first step was calling Robert Hensley, our family lawyer, a man who had known Gerald since college. His voice on the phone carried warmth, tinged with the gravity of long acquaintance. "Margaret," he said gently, "it's been a while. How are you holding up?" "I'm surviving," I replied, steady but firm. Then, lowering my tone, I added, "Robert, I need to see you. Privately. And I need your utmost discretion." When I arrived at his office, I carried with me not grief but resolve. Robert studied my face, as though searching for the widow he had known, the one softened by loss. Instead, he found a woman carved by betrayal. "I want to revise my will," I said plainly. "Everything Gerald and I built, all of it must be safeguarded, and it must never, under any circumstance, fall into Daniel or Melissa's hands." His brows furrowed. "Margaret, that's a very serious decision. Are you sure?" I leaned forward, my voice low and unyielding. I am more sure of this than anything in my life. My husband's legacy will not be squandered by greed. If Gerald could see what our son has become, he would beg me to do this. And so, with Robert's guidance, I transferred every asset, every property, every penny into a foundation established in Gerald's name. A foundation dedicated to education and charity, the causes he had cherished. The clause was ironclad. Daniel and Melissa were to receive nothing. Not a dollar. Not a key. Not even a trinket. When the documents were signed, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time since the garage, I felt air fill my lungs without the taste of dread. They had plotted to erase me. Instead, I was erasing them. But I did not stop there. I moved methodically, step by step, stripping away every corner of influence Daniel thought he possessed. I closed accounts he believed he controlled, accounts where he had nudged himself onto paperwork under the guise of helping me manage things. I changed passwords, redirected mail, severed ties with any service that bore his name alongside mine. The locks were next. Quietly, without ceremony, I replaced them all. Front door, back door, garage. The keys Daniel thought still granted him access to my world were now useless metal. I pictured him sliding one into the lock, only to find it refusing to turn, the door holding firm against him. The thought steadied me like a bomb. I gathered up documents, birth certificates, deeds, Gerald's business records, and placed them in a fireproof safe at Robert's office. No longer would they sit vulnerable in the study where Melissa's fingers had once lingered. Each paper sealed away was another brick in the wall I built between myself and their ambitions. Through it all, I maintained my mask. At dinner, when Daniel joked about how, one day this will all be mine, I forced a small smile, hiding the truth. It already wasn't. At breakfast, when Melissa asked if I had considered downsizing, I stirred my tea calmly, thinking instead of the locks she would no longer open. They believed time was their ally, that my age, my solitude, my fragility would eventually deliver them their prize. What they did not see was that I had already cut the strings. The empire they salivated over was slipping from their grasp, piece by piece, while they sat in ignorance. In the stillness of my room at night, I sometimes felt Gerald beside me, his presence like a quiet approval. He had worked his whole life for that legacy, and now I was its final guardian. Not Daniel, not Melissa, me. And though part of me ached with the kind of grief only a mother can know, the grief of erasing her own child from her future, the ache was nothing compared to the strength that coursed through me. For the first time, I felt not like prey, but like the hunter. I had chosen my battlefield, and I had already won the first strike. The day of reckoning arrived not with shouting or fists, but with papers, signatures, and the undeniable weight of law. I had orchestrated every detail in silence, and now the curtain was about to fall. Robert, our family lawyer, summoned Daniel and Melissa to his office under the pretense of a necessary update regarding Gerald's estate. I arrived first. The air in Robert's office carried the faint smell of old leather and ink, the kind of scent that spoke of generations of contracts sealed and promises broken. I sat across from Robert's desk, hands folded calmly in my lap. Though my heart thundered within my chest, my face betrayed nothing. I had worn masks long enough to learn from the best. The door opened sharply, and in slept Daniel and Melissa. My son's stride was confident, expectant. He looked like a man arriving to claim what was already his. Melissa followed close behind, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her lips curved in a smile too smug to be anything but premature victory. "Mom," Daniel said, nodding as though the room belonged to him. "So what's this about? Finally ready to make things official." His arrogance stung, but I held my tongue. I merely gestured to the empty chairs across from me. Robert adjusted his glasses, his voice even. "Thank you for coming. There have been significant updates regarding Mrs. Carter's estate, and it's important that we review them together." Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossing. "Finally. We've been saying for years this needed to be sorted out. Right, Melissa?" She gave a small nod, her eyes glinting like sharpened glass. Robert cleared his throat and began. He spoke in precise language, each word measured. The formation of the Gerald Carter Foundation, the transfer of assets, the clauses ensuring permanent exclusion. As the reality unfolded, I watched their faces shift, inch by inch, from certainty to disbelief. At first, Daniel chuckled, as though it were a misunderstanding. "Wait, you're saying?" "None of it? That can't be right. She wouldn't do that." Robert continued reading, unshaken. With each paragraph, the walls of their imagined empire crumbled. Melissa's smile faltered, her posture stiffening. She leaned toward Robert, her voice syrupy, controlled. "Surely there's been a mistake. Perhaps Margaret was confused, overwhelmed. She's not in the best state of mind these days." Robert looked up from the papers, his expression sharpened by decades of courtroom battles. Mrs. Carter was of sound mind when these documents were signed. I personally witnessed her clarity and intent. Legally, every safeguard is in place. This arrangement is final. The color drained from Melissa's face, her composure cracking at the edges. Daniel's voice rose, raw, trembling not with grief but with fury. "You can't do this. I'm your son." The last word tore from his throat, half accusation, half plea. I turned to him, reading his gaze with a calm steadiness that belied the storm inside me. "A son protects his mother," I said quietly, each syllable deliberate. "A son honors his father's memory. You are not my son. You are a stranger who chose greed over blood." His mouth opened, but no words followed. His eyes darted to Melissa, searching for rescue, for justification, for anything that would make this nightmare dissolve. Melissa tried again, her voice breaking into desperation. "Margaret, think of the family. Daniel has worked so hard. He deserves." Robert cut her off, his voice firm, final. "Legally, Mrs. Carter has secured every right. You have nothing." The words landed like a gavel strike, echoing in the silence that followed. Melissa slumped back into her chair, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Daniel's fury erupted once more, but it was the fury of a man watching sand slip through his clenched fists. "You're destroying me. You're destroying us. Do you know what you've done?" I inhaled slowly, letting the calm settle over me. "I know exactly what I've done. I've protected your father's legacy from being devoured by your greed. I've ensured that the empire he built with his sweat and my sacrifices will live on, not as fuel for your selfishness, but as hope for those who deserve it." For a long moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the room, each second a reminder of the collapse already underway. Daniel's face twisted with a rage that could find no outlet. Melissa's eyes glossed with unshed tears, not of sorrow, but of loss of the wealth she had already counted as hers. Their empire, built on assumption, on whispered plots, on my supposed fragility, had collapsed in a single afternoon. Not with shouts, not with violence, but with the quiet certainty of ink on paper. I rose from my chair, smoothing the fabric of my dress. My knees were steady, my hands calm. "This is the end of the conversation," I said, my voice as firm as stone. "There will be no appeal, no second chance. What Gerald and I built is beyond your reach, and so am I. I left them there, two faces carved in disbelief, staring at a future suddenly barren. The sound of the door closing behind me felt like a seal, heavy and irrevocable. The collapse of greed had come, swift and absolute, and I, for the first time in years, walked away unafraid. Now the house is quiet again. Sometimes too quiet, so still that the ticking of the old grandfather clock feels like a drumbeat echoing through hollow rooms. Yet within that silence lies a peace I had not known in years. The fear that once clung to these walls has lifted, replaced by a calm as steady as stone. I walk the hallways slowly, my hand grazing the wallpaper worn by decades of family life. Photographs line the walls, snapshots of birthdays, holidays, fleeting moments captured in frames. Gerald's face smiles from them, his laughter etched into the eyes that now only look at me through glass. At times, I close my eyes and imagine I can still hear his voice resonating through the house, deep and full, carrying warmth that could banish any chill. But then there are the other memories. The image of Daniel as a child, holding my hand too tightly on his first day of school, his cheeks wet with tears. The sound of his laughter when Gerald lifted him onto his shoulders during summer picnics. Those echoes live here too, and they strike a different chord, one of ache, of loss, of the cruel reality that the boy I raised and the man he became were not the same. Even now, I mourn that boy. I mourn the years I poured into him, the nights I stayed awake to watch him breathe during fevers, the sacrifices I made without hesitation. That grief will never leave me. But grief is not the same as weakness. And I know this. He no longer has the power to hurt me. I erased Daniel, not his existence, but his grasp. His claim over my life, my peace, my future is gone. He still walks this earth, but he no longer walks through me. He can no longer leach from my veins or shadow my steps. The empire he thought was his has been torn from his reach, and in that act of removal I reclaimed myself. It is strange how liberation feels. Not like fireworks or thunder, but like exhaling after holding your breath far too long. I had lived with a weight pressing on my chest, the invisible burden of being prey under my own roof. Now, each breath is fuller, cleaner. Even the air seems different, as though the house itself sighs in relief. In the evenings, I sit in Gerald's armchair, a shawl draped around my shoulders, and watch the light fade across the garden. The roses he planted continue to bloom, defiant and bright against the dusk. I often find myself talking to him in those quiet hours. I tell him of what has happened, of how our son betrayed us both, of how I fought to protect what we built. Sometimes I imagine he hears me, that his spirit lingers in the laughter of the wind through the branches, and though he cannot answer, I feel his approval in the calm that settles over me when I finish speaking. Justice, I have learned, is not blind. At least not mine. Justice wore my eyes, carried my hands, and was forged in my resolve. It was not a faceless system or a distant courtroom that saved me. It was my own will, sharpened by betrayal and strengthened by love for what Gerald and I had built. I became judge, jury, and executioner, not of life, but of greed, of entitlement, of the chains they tried to wrap around me. And satisfaction is all that remains. It is not joyous, not triumphant in the way victory in stories is described. No, it is quieter, deeper. It is the satisfaction of knowing I stood firm when it mattered most, that I did not surrender to the predators disguised as family. It is the satisfaction of surviving with dignity intact. Yet, even in this peace, I cannot deny the ache that lingers. A mother's heart does not turn to stone, no matter how sharp the betrayal. There are nights when I dream of Daniel as a boy again, when his laughter is untainted, when his eyes shine with innocence instead of hunger. I wake from those dreams with tears wetting my pillow, mourning not the man I lost, but the child I once held. But I do not regret what I did. Regret is for those who act in haste or cruelty. My actions were neither. They were deliberate, necessary, and just. I did not erase Daniel's life. I erased his dominion over mine. I gave him every chance to be a son, and he chose instead to be a stranger driven by greed. I merely answered his choice with one of my own. The world outside continues as it always does. Cars pass by, children laugh on sidewalks, seasons change. To them I am simply Margaret Carter, widow, aging woman living quietly in her house. They do not know the battles fought behind these doors, the empire stripped from the hands of betrayal, the justice carried out not with violence, but with paper, ink, and unwavering will. Perhaps that is best. Justice does not always need an audience. Sometimes it only needs to live in the heart of the one who claimed it. And as I sit here tonight, the house silent around me, Gerald's photograph smiling from the mantel, I feel that justice in my bones. It hums through me, steady and calm, like a heartbeat that will not falter. For once, justice was not blind. Justice had my eyes, my hands, my resolve. And satisfaction, quiet, unshakable satisfaction, is all that remains.